Good morning. My name is Gabriel Motzkin. I'm the director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and I can't begin to communicate to you what a pleasure it is to have you all here, because most of the stuff we do has nothing to do with what I personally am interested in, and this conference does, so I will actually be attending it throughout because I'm interested in hearing the lectures. And the reason is that I've been working in the last few years in the philosophy of history, and so naturally the idea of what the relation of history to time is of some importance. Now, I use this opportunity to do two things. One is to tell you in 1 minute something about Van Leer, and the other thing is to tell you my ideas about time, which I'm sure you've all heard of before. Basically, the institute you're in is an institute that's a multi-purpose institute of a kind that is rarely exists somewhere else, because we're both an institute of advanced study, we're a policy institute like the Brookings, and we're also a forum for social involvement in social programs. The reason is that the compromise that was reached by the donor, Polly Van Leer, and the first director, Yehuda Elkanah, was based on the idea that one part of the institute would do theoretical and academic work, and the other part would do social relevance programs. And that's a wonderful thing, because it means that we're constantly worried about how to translate theory into practice, or practice into theory, and a lot of dissident and political movements on the Israeli cultural landscape have started here. So in terms of this particular connection, we think it's a great place to be, but it does give us, from time to time, some bad publicity. We're happy to receive it, and that's what we do, and that's just so you have an idea of why you have been invited by this sort of curious establishment to come to Jerusalem. Having said that, I now want to switch to the second thing and talk about the problem of time. Now, the reason I like this conference so much is that, as you must have occurred to all of you, there is a big gap between physical time and biological time. Now, the physicists would like to think that the whole world is reducible to atoms and molecules, so anything that exists on what we call higher levels must also exist on the level of elementary particles. And the biologists of different stripes, some of them think it's genetic, some of them think that the level is higher up at individual or phenotypical or group selection even, think that different principles supervene on basic principles of the physical universe. Now, that's interesting to us because we're aware, all of us, that consciousness, or the kind of time that we have, which is a time that is eerily successive and non-successive, is very different from whatever the time of the cosmos is, whether it's the time of general relativity or anything else that you may think of. We view memory, or what we're about to do, not as successive time, and even Husserl was aware of that, that after all, we probably evolutionarily are facing the situation, what are we going to do next? Our memory, if you've regarded it, our memory is not sequential, it's spatial. So you go somewhere, and if you are at a place that you were 30 years ago, it suddenly emerges for you whether you go left or you go right. And the reason is you have to find where the honey is and where there are tigers and all the rest. So there are a lot of good reasons why we have that kind of consciousness of time. Now, on that, there supervenes the time of our lives, and the time of our lives does seem to have some kind of succession, but if you go back and look at all the cultural things that have been written about it, you see that there are great debates as to how that succession actually plays out in our subjective consciousness. What does that have to do with the time of the consciousness? Time of the cosmos doesn't turn out to have very much. Yet we would like to think that there would be some kind of unifying principle by which we could unite those. I doubt that that will happen because the cosmos, in this sense, is not alive. And because the cosmos is not alive, what we perceive as the time of the cosmos is not the time of a being who is trying to defeat entropy. After all, that's what we're trying to do, organized as eukaryotic cells. What we're trying to do is to get more energy than we expend, and in that we have a concept of time that relates very much to how we consume our energy. But in fact, the cosmos has none of these considerations at all. It's, I think, a great thing that in the 20th century we've been able to penetrate so many parts of the time of the cosmos, but of course there's a lot about it we don't understand. If we can't explain 96% of the matter in the cosmos, we still have a ways to go. You know, dark energy and dark matter together are 96%, and we're only at about a 4% explanation rate. So there's much more to be done in this particular sphere of physics. Nonetheless, it's also amazing to me that it took until the 20th century for intelligent beings such as we think we are to be able to penetrate the kinds of physics we do have. And that shows how uncommonsensical it must appear to human beings to be told that the cosmos is in a constant present without a now, or that the time is a function of the increasing acceleration of the universe in all directions, which apparently has no limits, we've been told in the last 20 years. We find it very hard to wrap our minds around these concepts because they have no correlate whatsoever in our experience, which is based on entirely different principles. And how you unite those and whether they can be reduced to one level, I assume that's one of the things that's going to be discussed in this conference along with other topics. To my mind, it's a burning question. I altogether think that in science we are facing a major question about what I would call reduction in scientific explanation, whether everything can be reduced to one basic level of explanation or not. And in about 2 years, we're going to do in the History and Philosophy of Science program that we do with the different universities in these countries, we're going to do a major conference on reduction in physics and biology, in which I tend to bring together the people who are the Stuart Kaufmans on one side, the people who fight on the other side, the physicists, because I think it's time that this issue would be accosted head on. Well, I can go on, but I'm going to stop right there because these are just random musings. And I wish you all, and myself too, a very interesting event. And I believe Yuval, you have some things you wanted to say. And I want to thank, I'm not going to name everybody who's connected with but producing this, but I want to thank everybody. Okay, so it's your turn.
I just wanted to very briefly thank a number of people and institutions that made this workshop possible. So on behalf of Michael and myself, I'd like to first say that this workshop is the cherry on the cake, I think is the expression in English. The cake in this case being 2 years of meetings that our Cosmological and Psychological Time research group held here in this building under the auspices and support of the Van Leer Institution, a very, very generous place. And so I'd like to first of all thank the Van Leer Institution and Professor Motzkin for giving us this framework. Next I need to, and am happy to thank the Israel Science Foundation, which very generously supported us in fundings for this conference. It's thanks also to their support as well as the Van Leer's institution's support that we were able to assemble such an impressive group of speakers from various corners of the planet, and I'd like to thank them. Next, I would like to thank Shulamit Laron, Shuli, who is the coordinator of public activities here at the Van Leer Institute, for tremendous help in terms of the administration of this conference. I'm sure you're all appreciating the fruit of this labor. And finally, I need to personally, and on behalf of all of us, thank Louis. Everybody knows Louis already? You should know Louis. You are all acquainted with Louis' administrative capabilities because together with Shuli, she worked very hard in putting together the poster and the hotels and everything that went into creating for us such a pleasant framework for this workshop. You should also know that Louis is on the brink of submitting her proposal for a master's degree in philosophy, which will deal with time as well, the direction of time. And she's doing all this. This is her main occupation. As a sidekick, as a hobby, she's also pursuing a PhD in mathematics. So if you have any questions in that domain, you can appeal to her for that as well. Finally, I'd like to thank all our overseas friends and speakers, some of which I already know, the others I'm very delighted to get to know, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming to Jerusalem for this workshop. Thomas Paine, the 18th century American writer and pamphletist, said that the whole religious complexion of the modern world is due to the absence from Jerusalem of a lunatic asylum. So I think, paraphrasing him, we can say that some, not all, but some of the religious and literary and scientific and philosophical assets of the world are due to the presence in Jerusalem of some research institutions, foremost among them probably the Van Leer Institution. It has to be said that sometimes by being in these institutions and just looking at the people and hearing what they're talking about, you can't know in which type of institution you are. It's a research institution or lunatic asylum. I'm sure our workshop is no exception to that, but I'm sure that whether it's going to be lunacy or philosophy, we're going to enjoy it. It'll be very thought-provoking, and thank you all very much for being here. Thanks. So we'll start right away?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, okay. So let me introduce the first speaker. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Nathan Oaklander, our first speaker. Nathan comes from the University of Michigan at Flint, and we're delighted to have him.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shalom. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, Mikhail Rubak and Yuval Dolev, for organizing this conference and for inviting me. It's a beautiful city, and I'm delighted to be in Israel. I also want to thank Shuli Laron for her assistance in since we've arrived, helping me print out materials and so on. Okay. There was a handout of some quotations I'm going to appeal to if you have that. Ever since the publication of Clifford Williams' paper on the metaphysics of A and B time, there has been an ongoing debate about whether or not there is a genuine metaphysical dispute between these two views, and if so, how precisely it is to be drawn. With the increased popularity of presentism, the debate, or lack of such, between presentism and eternalism, the currently fashionable name for the B theory, has taken center stage. Since for some, eternalism is compatible with either the A or B theory of time, the presentism-eternalism debate has reignited the original question of how, if at all, A and B time are to be distinguished. The title of my paper, A and B and R Theories of Time and Debate, is meant to signal that I too am going to enter into the question of the legitimacy of the dispute. But the limitations of this essay must be stated at the outset. I am not going to be debating these different views in the sense of giving arguments for and against the various gambits in the philosophy of time. Nor am I going to be directly concerned with the difference between A and B theories, since I believe that the proper way to draw the distinction or the lines in the metaphysical debate cuts across all these views. My primary purpose is rather to clarify a genuine debate and to indicate some of the ontological issues that are important for the future of the philosophy of time. To accomplish that goal, I shall proceed in the following manner. In the first section, I will discuss a third view, the Russellian theory of time, hereafter the R theory, and distinguish it from the B theory as it is typically understood. In order to clarify the I theory, I shall distinguish three notions of realism and touch on a third, and argue that the R theory is realist in all three senses. Having distinguished R time from B time, I shall in the second section turn to the distinction between R time and A time, and argue that Clifford Williams, who asserts that there is no distinguishability of A and B time, and Michael Burley, who maintains that there is a distinction, are both mistaken. So the first section is on temporal realism and the R theory. It is common to distinguish two different theories of time. Those who maintain a dynamic view of time endorse the idea that time involves transition, flow, or passage from one temporal object to the next. And those who maintain a static view of time that involves unchanging and fixed relations between temporal objects and unchanging tenseless facts. Starting with McTaggart's article on the unreality of time and chapter on time from the nature of existence, and gaining popularity with Richard Gale's anthology on the philosophy of time and book, The Language of Time, the various incarnations of these two views have come to be called the A theory, after McTaggart's A series of events ordered by the A properties of pastness, presentness, and futurity, and the B series of events ordered by B relations of earlier than and later than. One of the purportedly strongest arguments in support of the A theory and against the B theory is based on the phenomenology of temporal passage, which is dynamic and not static, as is seemingly required by the B theory. B theorists typically buy into this line of reasoning, if not its conclusion, and develop anti-realist, that is, mind-dependent views of the dynamic aspects of temporal experience and reductive analyses of the tenses and becoming that are compatible with a static or four-dimensional block universe. Ironically, it seems to me, as I shall argue, that without the B series, it is the A theory that is static. And without the A series, it is the B series that is properly dynamic. I should really be talking about the R series, whose terms are ordered by our Russellian temporal relations, of which I shall speak more shortly. If these claims are correct, then there are three important consequences. First, the standard objection to the B or R theory that it leaves out the transitory aspect of time is mistaken. Second, the claim that the A theory is realist and the B/R theory anti-realist, since it renders transition mind-dependent, is also mistaken. And third, if we assume, as I believe we should, that an adequate ontology of time must ground both the transitory and the eternal aspects of time, then the R theory is well suited to accomplish that task. To defend these claims, let me begin with the first, namely that the A theory without temporal relations cannot account for the dynamic aspect of time. Actually, this assertion is not as controversial as it might appear, since A theorists, beginning with McTaggart and as recently as Kit Fine, explicitly acknowledge that succession is essential to passage, whether construed as the donning and doffing of A properties, the successive actualization of possible worlds, the transition from one time to the next, or the coming into existence and going out of existence of events. Therefore, without succession, which is nothing other than one moment coming after the next, the A theory in its various embodiments is static and leaves out something essential to time. As Fine puts it, the passage of time can be taken to consist in the successive possession of the absolute property of present or now. This property passes, as it were, from one moment to the next, and it is in its passage that the passage of time can be taken to consist. The point being that it's not enough to have one term in the time series as being present to give you passage. In order to have passage, the present must successively go from one time to the next. Fine understands passage in terms of the successive possession of the property of presentness, and for that reason, the tensed fact that a particular time t has the property of presentness is alone insufficient to provide an adequate ground for the passage of time. He explicitly makes this point in the following passage. But although the realist possesses the right concept of the present in terms of which an explanation of the proposed sort might be given, he does not possess the right metaphysics by reference to which it might actually be sustained. For all he could properly say is that a particular time to, which happens to be present, possesses the absolute property of being present. But what we wanted was the successive possession of the property of being present, not merely its current possession. Fine continues, his, the tense realist, conception of reality, for all that he has said, may be as static or block-like as the anti-realist, the only difference lying in the fact that his block has a privileged center. Clearly, Fine believes that tense realism alone is insufficient for temporal realism, since tensed facts are insufficient to give us passage or distinguish space from time. In order to ground the dynamic aspect of time, we must have an adequate account of succession, or the transition from earlier to later temporal objects. What then is the proper metaphysical analysis of succession or temporal relations and the transitory or dynamic aspect of time? Consider that question first with regard to the realism-idealism issue. Are temporal relations and the transitory aspect of time mind-independent or mind-dependent? There is a superficial agreement between the B and R theory on this issue, since they are both realists with regard to temporal relations. However, R relations are importantly different from B relations, as they are usually understood, for example, by Meller, Lepedvin, Armstrong, Smart, Grumbaum, Everdijk, and others. For B theorists, typically analyze temporal relations in terms of causal relations, or the physical relation of entropic increase. For Husserlians, such as the early Broad, and yes, Broad in his initial musings on time was a B theorist. For Husserlians, such as the early Broad, Richard Brathwaite, R.M. Blake, and later ones, such as Gustav Bergman, Erwin Tegmeyer, J.M. Shorter, and myself, temporal relations are given in experience as phenomenologically simple relations, and are thus taken as unanalyzable and irreducible mind-independent entities in the ontology of time. B theorists who do not countenance R relations typically differ from R theorists regarding the transitory or dynamic aspect of time as well. Thus, for example, Laurie Paul sets herself the task of explaining how the existence of a static four-dimensional universe of a series of changeless events standing in unchanging relations can explain the flow, quote, the flow of successively existing events responsible for the animated character or flow of change. Presumably, the world does not contain flow, therefore, how is the B theorist to explain our perception of it? Paul responds by arguing that even in the static universe of the four-dimensionalist, the reductionist can provide an account of how temporal experience could arise from the way the brains of conscious beings experience and interpret cognitive inputs from a series of static events. Her explanation goes something like this, and I quote, "When we have an experience of passage, we can interpret this as an experience that is the result of the brain producing a neural state that represents inputs from earlier and later temporal stages and simply fills in the representation of motion or of changes. Thus, according to the reductionist," she says, "there is no real flow or animation in changes that occur across time. Rather, a stage of one's brain creates the illusion of such flow as the causal effect of prior stages on this stage of one's brain." Paul is claiming that our experience of as passage is an illusion. And therefore, while time seems to pass from one moment to the next, it does not really do so. It is just a mind-dependent phenomenon with no objective reality. Of course, this is a possible position to take. But for the Russellian, who is a phenomenological realist and maintains that a simple, irreducible temporal feature of experience is dynamic, and thus needs an ontological ground, there is an alternative. The alternative is to construe the R theory as not only realist with regard to the mind-independent temporal relations, but also realist with regard to transition, passage, or the dynamic aspect of time. In other words, for the Russellian, the phenomenology of temporal passage is R-theoretic. That is, temporal passage, or the dynamic aspect of time, is grounded in a temporal succession or transition from earlier to later temporal items. That, on one of Russell's earlier views, involves an intrinsic sense or direction from one relatum to the other. Thus, an R-theorist should not fear the words temporal succession or transition. They shouldn't fear that that would commit them to a succession or a transition. Succession is not an A relation, but it is not a static relation either. Succession is not a transition from non-existence to existence or from futurity to presentness to pastness, but it does not follow that it is no transition at all. A transition is a temporal succession of opposite states, and succession is based on the earlier than relation. A temporal relational fact itself doesn't change. It is eternal in a sense to be explained below, but may be a change, and in that sense involves a transition from earlier to later events or particulars, or more neutrally, temporal items. So the point that I'm making here, by way of distinguishing the B theory from the R theory, is both in the nature of the temporal relation, namely that in the case of the B theory, the temporal relation is typically analyzed causally, whereas in the case of the R theory, the R relation is a simple, unanalyzable temporal relation that's irreducible to causation or anything else. And with regard to the dynamic aspect of time, the B theory typically holds that transition is something that's mind-dependent. But the R theory maintains that in being presented or acquainted with transition, we're acquainted with the R relation, that the R relation is itself a dynamic relation that has an intrinsic sense from one term to the next. That the is earlier than relation is dynamic has been argued for by Erwin Tegmeyer in the following passage, where he says, when we hear, according to Russell, what we hear, according to Russell, when we hear the C tone preceding the D tone, is the relational universal of occurring earlier than, together with its relata. We hear nothing else. Let us assume that we don't recognize the first tone as a C and the second as a D. Thus we hear only a temporal fact, which as such is dynamic. If the fact is dynamic, which one could take for granted, the relational universal in it must be dynamic. 2. Now Russell introduces the relational universal as the one which holds between the two tones in the fact of our example. One can conclude that the relation occurring earlier than is a dynamic relation. On the R theory, as opposed to a typical B theory, the passage of time is rooted in a simple, unanalyzable temporal relation. For that reason, not only are A properties incapable of grounding passage without the relation of succession, the R theory with R relations is capable of grounding passage without A properties. Indeed, given R relations, there cannot be A properties, for they would make temporal relations dependent on the monadic temporal properties of their terms and consequently not R relations. So in saying that R relations is simple and unanalyzable, it's saying that temporal relations can hold between terms even if those terms don't have A properties. If they did have A properties, then the relations would be somewhat dependent upon the properties, which is not true of R relations. I want to turn next to two questions concerning the ontological status of temporal relations. First, are they universal or particular? And second, how are the facts that temporal relations enter into related to time? With these questions, we hit upon the realism-nominalism issue as it applies to temporal relations. In briefly exploring them, we shall see once again how the R theory differs from the B theory in at least one of its typical formulations, and more importantly, how the R theory's realism can account for both the dynamic and, in a sense to be explained, the eternal aspect of time. D.M. Armstrong is a B theorist who in one of his more recent writings wrote, and I quote, "If you are, like me, an omnitemporalist, holding that past, present, and future are equally real, then the fact that there are truths about the past and about the future should not be reflected in the ontology of states of affairs. There are, of course, states of affairs involving temporal relations, but that is all." In claiming that the past, present, and future are equally real, B theorists are somewhat obfuscating because they also maintain that no event really is past, present, or future. Leaving such matters aside, the question I want to explore vis-a-vis the nominalism-realism issue is Armstrong's position regarding temporal relations and the states of affairs that they enter into. Armstrong is a naturalist who believes that the spatio-temporal universe contains all that there is. And yet he believes in universals. Thus he believes that the non-relational qualities of things exist at the spatio-temporal location of the particulars that exemplify them. What then of temporal relations? If they too are concrete, then where, or better, when, are they located? Armstrong offers two responses to this challenging question. On the one hand, Armstrong suggests that causal theories of time would solve the problem of the location of temporal relations, since, I quote, they identify temporal and spatial relations with causal relations, or at least analyze the holding of temporal relations in terms of the holding of causal relations. Whatever virtue the causal theory of time has, and for the R-realist there is little to recommend it, the causal theory does nothing to resolve the problem of the localization of temporal relations. A world of causally related particulars, that is, instantiated universals, simply re-raises the question of the location of the causal relation. It does not answer it. On the other hand, Armstrong claims that even if temporal relations are not located in space and time, it does not follow that they are outside of space and time. And he tries to make sense out of that in the following passage. For it is part of the essence of space and time that they involve such spatio-temporal relations, whether these be conceived of as relations between things or between particular places and times. So if they help to constitute space-time, then it is no objection to their spatiality that they are not located in space-time. I find this reply unavailing. If spatio-temporal relations help to constitute space-time, then surely they are constituents of space-time and so are in need of categorization. If spatio-temporal relations, or just considering temporal relations, are in time, then they would be things or places, things or times, moments, or occupy moments. And so not the relations between things or places and moments they are intended to be. If temporal relations are not located in space-time, then Armstrong's naturalism fails. A similar dilemma arises regarding Armstrong's analysis of states of affairs involving temporal relations. If temporal relational states of affairs are concrete, that is, if they exist in time, then either the conjunction of them would exist at the same time, or each relational temporal fact or state of affairs would exist at a different time. If all temporal relational states of affairs exist at the same time, then the world would truly be a simultaneous block universe, a totem simul, which is absurd. If each temporal relational fact exists at a different time, then however time was understood, either relationally or in terms of absolute moments, the need for a second time dimension would be required and an infinite regress would ensue. If the facts that have temporal relations as constituents are abstract and outside of time, then once again Armstrong's naturalism fails. Contrast Armstrong with the R theory. For the Russellian, temporal relational states of affairs are facts, while they are not themselves in time, are indeed temporal, since they contain temporal relations. R facts, like A is earlier than B, are entities in their own right, over and above their constituents, and as such, they are not in time in that they do not exemplify non-relational temporal properties or stand in temporal relations. In that sense, understood as a Russellian series composed of a conjunction of R facts, time is timeless. This view gives some meaning to an aphorism I favor, namely that time is timeless or eternal in just this sense. Though time contains temporal relations, time does not exemplify them. Time is timeless in the further sense that the ontological ground of temporal phenomena are relations, and on the R theory, relational universals such as occurring earlier than are timeless. Given a realist ontology of R relations and R facts, the Russellian theory is able to account for both the dynamic and the eternal aspects of time. That both aspects of time are part of the reality of time is stated by an early R theorist, R.M. Blake, in his critique of Broad's open future theory in an article entitled On Mr. Broad's Theory of Time, published in Mind in 1925. In scientific thought and elsewhere, of course, Broad maintains that the Russellian view leaves out something that is fundamental to the nature of time. Blake raises and responds to Broad's objection in the following long passage. His, namely Broad's, concept of an unanalyzable becoming is very similar to Bergson's equally ultimate duration, and to Whitehead's passage of nature or moving on. As Mr. Broad says, we are naturally tempted to regard the history of the world as existing eternally in a certain order of events. The trouble with this is that it seems to take the temporal character out of succession out of time and to make it static, or as Bergson puts it, to spatialize time. Now there seems to me a strange mixture of truth and illusion in all this. There is certainly a unique character about time which cannot be reduced to anything else. Time is filled with events, and events are happenings, things that come to pass, that succeed one another in a fixed direction of earlier and later. This feature of time is revealed to us in our immediate experience of duration and the passage of events. But we may be equally certain that however much of succession there may be in events, every event has, in the order of succession just the place that it has and none other. The order as a whole, however much it may be in order of change and of succession, must in a sense be static. For it must be true that it is what it is. Let fluidity be never so fluid, the fact that it remains so, the fact that it is so remains unaltered. Blake is attempting to reconcile the fundamental features of our experience of time and its true nature. That time has a unique and irreducible character that distinguishes it from space, that is revealed to us through our experience of the succession of events on the one hand, with the notion that time forms an ordered series of terms in which every term has just the place it has and no other, and that the whole conjunction of facts is unchanging, on the other hand. I am suggesting that to understand these two aspects of time, one must recognize that time contains timeless yet dynamic relations and temporal yet eternal facts. To countenance our facts in addition to our relations is crucial to providing a ground for the unchanging character of time as a whole and the dynamic character of time within it. J.S. Mackenzie has nicely stated the relation between the eternal and the dynamic in the following passage. There is no time outside the process. Hence, the process as a whole might be said to be eternal, even though every particular part in it has a place in time. The process as a whole, when we thus conceive of it, is not in time. Rather, time is in the process. Time is simply the aspect of successiveness which the eternal process contains. Once we have made the relevant distinctions and provided an epistemological, phenomenological, and ontologically realist analysis of the temporal relations and facts of which they are constituents, we arrive at a view that can be justly called temporal realism.
What was the last quote was from whom? The last quote?
It was from J.S. Mackenzie. I think I might have not included that quote on the handout. I'm glad you pointed that out. And it's from Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, published, edited by Hastings in 1913. But there's a 1955 edition of it. Okay, so how are we fixed for time here?
Okay.
We started early. You have lots of time.
I have lots of time.
That's good. How much more do you need?
Probably 20 minutes or so. Is that all right? Okay.
15 will be better than 20.
Okay, all right. So, I mean, one thing I'll say by means of summary is that the dynamic aspect of time, the flowing aspect of time, what makes time arguably, is grounded in a timeless universal that's given in experience the early than relation, given in a specious present. But time, in addition to the dynamic aspect, is what it is, and it's not something else. That time as a whole is not itself in time. That time is eternal in the sense that the conjunction of these dynamic facts, which is the whole of time, is not itself in time. And to say that it is not itself in time is to say that it doesn't stand in temporal relations or occupy moments of time. It is eternal, even though it's composed of dynamic facts. That's the R theory. Having clarified the R theory and distinguished it from the B theory, I want to next distinguish the R theory from the A theory. In order to do so, I shall turn to a recent debate between Clifford Williams and Michael Burley over the legitimacy of the A-B controversy. I will argue that it too suffers from a failure to appreciate how both of those views differ from the R theory, and thus fail to realize that what is most fundamentally at stake in the debate between the disputants in the metaphysical physics of time are the different accounts of the ontological status of temporal relations and transition, temporal facts, and the relation both kinds have to time. So this is section 2 on the debate over the indistinguishability of A and B time. Recall that the usual way of referring to B time as a block universe, static, eternal, and tenseless, whereas A time, on the other hand, is referred to as dynamic, tense time, in which time or events in time is passing or flowing and is the basis of ordinary change. Williams argues that these two ways of describing time omit something that is common to both. In both A time and B time, there is transition. A transition in A time and B transition in B time. But he argues that there is no difference between these two kinds of transition, and thus there is nothing different about these two kinds of time. In a reply, Burley responds to Williams by arguing that there is a genuine disagreement between A time and B time. Burley claims that if we grant that time involves transition, there is a clear difference between these two theories. A theorists are realists with regard to time, since they believe that transition is an intrinsic feature of events, independently of our experience of it, whereas B theorists are anti-realists, since they deny that transition is a feature of events independently of our experience. I shall argue, however, that there are mistakes in both Williams and Burley's reasoning for and against the indistinguishability thesis. Williams correctly recognizes that transition is essential to both our experience and reality of time, that it is known ostensibly, and that it involves a primitive temporal relation, but he mistakenly argues that there is no difference between these two kinds of transition, namely A transition and B transition, since he misunderstands A time as including R relations in among its ontological commitments. Burley, on the other hand, correctly rejects the indistinguishability thesis, but he misrepresents the difference since he fails to consider R-time, or misunderstands it by claiming that B-time is anti-realist. Before arguing that Williams and Burley are guilty of these mistakes, it is time to have some preliminary understanding of the ontology of A-time. And for that, we shall go to its source, McTaggart. There are at least two main interpretations of McTaggart's positive account of time. On the standard interpretation of McTaggart's positive account of time, there is both a B series whose terms are related by temporal relations, and there is an A series, or series of such, whose terms exemplify the monadic temporal properties of pastness, presentness, and futurity. And there is temporal becoming, the acquiring and shedding of A properties by the terms in the B series. This view is called the AB theory of time, and it is inherently ambiguous since the distinction I made in the last section between B and R relations is seldom drawn. So I have on the handout that the standard view is to think of McTaggart as having B relations and then also having A properties. But B relations could be either traditional B relations or R relations, so that there are two different interpretations of the standard view of McTaggart. There is another, and neither of those interpretations, by the way, are faithful to McTaggart's own positive view of time, but they are the standard ones in the literature. There is another interpretation of the B series according to which temporal relations are analyzable or reducible in terms of the application of the A series to the non-temporal but ordered C series, whose generating relation is earlier than. Is, for McTaggart, included in. C series is a non-temporal series. On this view, the direction of time in its transitory or dynamic aspect is grounded in A properties moving along a non-temporal C series. For McTaggart, it is the application of the A series to the C series that generates a B series with a direction or sense. For that reason, he says, and I quote, "The B series, on the other hand, is not ultimate. For given a C series of permanent relations of terms, which is not in itself temporal, and therefore is not a B series, and given the further fact that the terms of this C series also form an A series, it results that the terms of the C series become a B series, those which are placed first in the direction from past to future being earlier than those which are farther in the direction of the future." Clearly, the resulting B series is not Russellian, since R relations are not analyzable as in McTaggart in terms of a non-temporal series having temporal properties. With this background, we can return to my critique of Williams. Williams argues that the usual ways of representing A transition and B transition makes A transition incoherent and misrepresents B time. He says, suppose we say first that in A time, presentness or the now moves from time to time, whereas in B time, there is nothing that moves from time to time. This is a natural way of picturing the different kinds of transition. It seems odd to add something to B time that is missing from it, namely the movement of the present. This something more, according to advocates of A time, is a rock-bottom peculiarity of time that is missing from B time. For Williams, this interpretation of A time, involving presentness moving from time to time along a temporal series, is mistaken, since it renders A transition incoherent. It gives rise to questions regarding the rate of movement of the now, the need for a second time dimension, and more generally McTaggart's paradox. In other words, given the AB interpretation of the A theory that Williams accepts, there already is transition in the B relation qua R relation, and for that reason there is no need to introduce a moving now in the in A time, which just duplicates transition unnecessarily. The interpretation of B time as lacking transition is, Williams maintains, also mistaken, since it treats particulars in time like points in space, since all events in it are somehow eternally there, like the parts of a big block that are fixed forever. Once Williams eliminates A properties from this typical yet mistaken understanding of A time as involving B or R relations and A properties, his indistinguishability thesis becomes compelling, since there would be no difference between the A, B, and R accounts of transition because they all involve R relations. I'd say we have 5 minutes more. Okay. However, Williams' indistinguishability thesis is mistaken. There's many different accounts of transition as there are different accounts of temporal relations, and all but one of them is decidedly anti-Russellian. On the typical presentist accounts, transition is analyzed in terms of coming into existence and going out of existence of presently existing entities, and the ground of temporal relation is in what presently exists, and certainly not in our relations. For some open future or growing block theorists, C.D. Broad, for example, temporal relations are not our relations, since transition is grounded in the coming into existence of fresh slices of existence that are added to the sum total of existence. On this view, temporal relations come into existence as events become present. For example, when an event E is present, it does not stand in the is earlier than relation to anything, but at the next moment it acquires the relational property of being earlier than, say, event E prime. In that case, however, the fact that E is earlier than E prime cannot be timeless in the sense of being outside of time, since there is a time when it does not exist and a time when it comes into existence, namely when E prime does. Thus, on the open future theory, both temporal relations and the temporal relational facts they enter into exist in time and are so quite unlike our relations and eternal R facts. On the full A theory, or at least one version of it, according to which there are past, present, future times and events, the temporal relation that obtains between them is not an R relation. On one version of the A theory, that I have elsewhere called the modified A theory, temporal relations are not primitive or ontologically on a par with A characteristics. Rather, A characteristics are more fundamental and are essential to the ontological structure of time, because temporal relations can uphold between terms only if those terms have A characteristics. In Ostensible Temporality, Broad attributes to McTaggart this ontological essay of temporal relations that he explains in the following passage. Even if we reject the view that E is earlier than Y, means that there is a difference in the A characteristics of X and Y and that this difference is positive, there remains another alternative which would suffice for McTaggart's purpose. It might be suggested that the relation earlier than can hold only between terms which have A characteristics, just as harmonic relations can hold only between terms which have pitch. And it might be suggested that the degree of the B relation between two terms depends on the difference between the determinate values of their A characteristics, just as the harmonic relations between two notes depend on the difference between the absolute pitches of the two. In fact, to use an expression of Meinong's, we might be able to say that B relations are founded upon the difference in A characteristics of the related terms. Thus, on the modified A theory, events cannot stand in temporal relations unless they exemplify A properties. And therefore, temporal relations between events in this version of the A theory is not an R relation whose terms neither exemplify A properties nor are founded on them. Clearly, then, there is a dispute between A and R theorists over the proper analysis of transition and succession. And as we have seen in the previous section, the same dispute occurs between B and R theorists. We may conclude, therefore, that Williams' indistinguishability thesis is mistaken. So, if we keep the different interpretations of A time with their different analyses of temporal relations and transition distinct, and recognize that there are still other B and R theoretic analyses of temporal relations and transition, temporal facts and the temporal facts that such relations enter into, and the relation of those facts to time, then there are ontological differences between A, B, and R theories of time. And the debate between those theories remains a legitimate question for debate. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for discussion. Barry, you were the first.
Thanks, Nathan. A lot of what you said sounded very plausible to me about a lot of aspects of time, but just to seek clarification. Is your M theory committing you to panpsychism? That everything in the entire universe has a mental aspect? That in the way that people like, I think, Whitehead and probably Bergson thought. My reason for thinking that is that if you seem to be saying that the R relation is manifest in experience as flow, as directed flow characteristic, and exactly the same relationship is found everywhere. There's only one R relation that's found in both experiences and in the rest of the universe before any human beings were around. It's the same relationship which is, in my experience, is also in sort of Pluto, that existed in the matter in the heart of Pluto 10 billion years ago. Doesn't that mean that the matter in Pluto must be experiential as well, to be flowing in the same way as my experience? I was wondering if you could actually, the R theories slides into a process metaphysic which you might not actually want to buy into, or not.
Well, I mean, my idea is that sometimes when we are directly acquainted with the R relation, which is nothing other than the earlier than relation, as we are in the case of a rapid succession. I mean, Russell and Broad talk about our knowledge of time is built up from our immediate experience of succession. And that immediate experience, while the experience is something that couldn't exist without consciousness, it doesn't follow from that the object of experience couldn't exist without consciousness. So that, yes, I'd say whenever you have an R relation that actually holds, I mean, we might be deceived about there being an R relation because the two events might not actually be successive, but they or the two particulars, that one follow the other. But it may actually also be so that even though my knowledge of the dynamic aspect of time depends upon me being aware of succession, the object of that knowledge is not necessarily mind-dependent. That's how I'm thinking of it.
Do you want to avoid panpsychism, or you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the typical B theorist will treat transition as being a mental phenomenon. I mean, because what they're afraid of is that if one accepts transition or passage as something that actually exists in the world, then one is committed to an a-theoretic ontology, either in terms of the property of presentness or some absolute sense of coming into or going out of existence, or however it may be interpreted. But what I'm suggesting is that while it's true that there is passage, the fact of that truth does not automatically entail a theoretic ontology. I mean, I'm providing a ground, it's just not an a-theoretic ground.
Meir?
Well, actually, my question is related to this discussion. I like the idea, I like the idea that temporal relations are ought to be thought of as primitive, as the R theory, as you said, in the R theory. The trouble is that I'm not sure. Usually, I like things which I don't understand, and I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I think it's not clear. The worry is that. Of course, it seems to make things easier if you say that we have here some sort of a primitive relation which is not analyzable in any way. It does not seem. I mean, it's not. At least, I mean, I can speak from my own experience. I'm not sure I understand what the primitiveness here means. Whereas in the other approach, in the A theory approach, where when one talks about transitions and succession and so on, but it is supposed to be analyzed in terms of some other things which we think we understand, the situation might be better. So my question is, and this is why I asked you at the beginning, at the middle of your talk about Mackenzie. Because you said things like time is in the process, which are supposed to explain this primitiveness. But I'm not sure I understand. Can you try to say something about that?
Well, a little. If it's primitive, I can't say too much. But I come at it from two directions. And that is that from the directions of a-theoretic analysis, yes, they do have something to say about it, and in that sense, it can be understood. But I put understanding in quotes because I've spilt a lot of ink on arguing that you can understand it. That Taggart's paradox, in one form or other, creates problems to all these different a-theoretic ways of understanding it. Now that's, I can't go through that now, but that's my main reason for not. There are scientific issues about whether or not there's a global now and so on, but that's not my main problem with the A theory. And in terms of the primitiveness, I just am taking for granted that sometimes in a small span of time, so-called species present, that there's maybe a few seconds that I'm aware of, I can experience first this, then that, and that is. Then that's the experience of passage. I mean, what is the experience of passage after all? And then the question is, well, how are we going to analyze it? What are we going to say about it? And to me, the simplest thing is to say that it is simple. It's just like being read is a simple quality that we, well, depending upon whether or not you're a scientific realist, but I am a phenomenological realist, so I take read to be a simple quality that can't be analyzed. So, how would you respond to that?
Yes, please.
I would like to relate to two comments. One earlier then, and the second about the quality of the passage of time, experience of time. I'm a musicologist. I was dealt for a long time with problems of notation. How does one notate music? How it came into being and so on. So to begin with, we all agree that music unfolds in time, in some form or fashion. We also can agree, sort of in a Jamblichian sense, that it moves from the future into the past. I mean, it goes through us. You know, composition starts and it comes to an end. Only then do we know what has taken place in total. So now, in terms of the independence, the quality of A and B is insignificant, meaningless, totally meaningless in music, always has been and continues to be, because it's only the spatial distance between A and B that makes a difference. And in the development also of notation, unless there were all kinds of suggestions, naming it, talking about earlier and later and so on, nothing was accepted, nothing worked, only the relationship that was created as though it were a curve. The curve. Now we also know from brain studies, now we know that the experience of what takes in a melody or whatever, when you have the notation independent notes, that in our brains, when we sort of, the working of the brain creates a curve. In other words, when we talk about something that is written in isolated notes and we talk about as a melody, in fact our brain makes of it a melody. So up to it, it exists as a melody. And everything, you know, whatever goes into the past from way back, whether Aristotle doesn't matter whom you would like to engage, or the transition in the 13th century to Aristotelian thinking of time, you know, by movement and quality of time, that all these factors, in fact, if you look at brain studies, which interests me, you find that the way we went about handling these things, you know, are not so off from what really takes place when we process the information. So the major correction I want to introduce is, no, there is no such thing. This pitch and that pitch it's meaningless in terms of earlier and later. It's only what is in between them, which is not even heard. It is the space between them that counts in music. And because music is trying it treats time on time. The quality of the music, the experience that it creates is time on time. And it was very difficult to create it, literally to create it. And the time on time is what mattered for the experiencing of time and unfolding of time, and so on and so forth.
Okay, well, I greatly appreciate your question.
It's not a question, I make it
The point that
it is important if one talks about Russell, giving an example of A and B, and talking about earlier and later, and this becomes significant. And if you tell us that
maybe we'll let Nathan comment on the comment if you'd like.
Okay, so I'll just comment on a couple of things. One about the passage from the future to the present to the past. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because the notion of the dynamic aspect of time or temporal becoming involves more than what I was analyzing. For example, one aspect of the dynamic aspect of time or becoming is the experience of the present. That is the sense that what's going on now has an aliveness, a vividness to it that the past and the future don't have. I mean, that's also goes under the rubric of the dynamic aspect of time, and the presence of experience. That not only is there experience of the present, but we could judge of our experiences that they're present, and so that needs to be talked about. And then in notion of passage, one understands not only the transition from one moment to the next that I'm saying we're given with, but also the idea of the movement from the future to the present to the past. Now, for someone like me, I don't believe that there's a future, a present, or a past, really. You know, I mean, so that I'm going to have to analyze. That's something that I don't take as simple. That I'd have to analyze that. And there's a story about that has to do with different cognitive attitudes, temporal relation of different cognitive attitudes towards that event that's purportedly moving from the future to the present to the past. So that's now as far as the what you were saying about music, I have a passage from Frank Ramsey that. Where he makes a distinction that is my comment on your comment, and I'll let it speak for itself. It's a quotation that... let me see. He says that I'm sorry, I thought I had it right at my fingertips here. That okay. This is from a manuscript entitled Note on Time, and he explains how the different ways of representing an R series may mistakenly lead us to think that we need to add something more to a sequence to make it temporal. And he says, Ramsey notes that when we try to imagine a series of events in time, we could do this either by, quote, going through the events one after another in the order in which they happened, as when one rehearses a tune in one's mind, that one could think of them as successive, or we may want to have all the events in our minds at once in order to better see their relations. We then imagine them spread out before us along the line like the notes in the score. That's the end of the quote. And the resulting series, if we think of the notes as spread out in front of us, is like a spatial series, and then we need time on time, so to speak, to get flow. But if we think of the notes in time as we hear them, then we have a different conception of their being spread out in time.
Okay, thanks. Ariel.
I wanted to ask...
Ariel, I'm sorry, we're kind of beginning to run out of time, so let's shorten the questions.
Okay, I have two questions. I'll ask one. I wanted to ask about the claim that time is itself not in time, or that specifically temporal relations don't stand in temporal relations to other things. That seems, on the face of it, there seems to me a good argument against that point, in that if on your view, we experience temporal relations. Now, it seems to me that when whichever object or item we experience, we must experience it as present. Now, it appears to us as present. So on the face of it, those temporal relations will have the property of presentness, and will stand in temporal relations. It seems to me, on the face of it, more plausible to think of temporal relations as just perpetually existing, rather than atemporal. So I wonder what particular reason you have for denying this, for denying that temporal relations are in time themselves.
Okay, so if I understood you, your argument for claiming that the first argument for claiming that temporal relations are in time is that they appear to us as present.
Yes.
And so as having the property of presentness.
Yes.
And if something has the property of presentness, then it's present. Then it's in time.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So my response to that is that there is no property of presentness. We're not aware of temporal relations as having the property of present. Now we are, because there is no such property. Because you assume that there is property, you're in trouble. Okay, but there is, as I was saying before, the experience of present. I mean, there is, but to me, to experience something as present involves nothing more than being presented with it. To be present is to be presented in perception with the R fact and the R relation. So that it's a universal, it's a timeless entity, but it is is not, because it's a timeless entity, it's not present. Or, well, it's not present because there's no property.
So timeless thing can be perpetually presented or continually
presented. Yeah. I mean, it's a universal. But it's not, I mean, so the other point you made, which was, so what I try to argue against was Armstrong, who believes in universals, but claims that the universals exist in space and time. I mean, that everything exists in space and time. Now as far as the idea of it perpetually existing, which I think is what Armstrong is committed to, then if the whole conjunction of temporal relational facts exist at one time, then everything exists at once. I mean, there's no, okay, and if you say they exist at different times, if you understand the times as moments, then there has to be a relation between those moments in which, but the R theory is that time is just a relation. So there is no time that it exists at.
Yeah, I have a question about the R relations. So you contrasted your R theory with the B theory, and one difference, if I understand it correctly, is that you claim that the R relations are dynamic, whereas other people's B relations aren't. So I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about what makes it the case, or what the dynamicness of the R relations consists in.
Well, it's something that we're given in experience, that there's a flow of time, that there's a whoosh of time, that Williams, the myth of passage, that we're just given with temporal movement.
So there's a quick follow-up. So if I'm a regular B theorist, couldn't I say exactly the same? So what we're directly acquainted with, what we see and experience are causal relations, we observe them, and they're dynamic.
Yeah, but the point is that I think that we're oftentimes when we're acquainted with this dynamic relation or the dynamism, we are not acquainted with the causal relation. So that you could have dynamism. Even though you could experience dynamism, even though you don't experience a causal relation.
So the dynamism is also primitive.
The primitive is the relation, and the dynamism is that. I mean, as I was mentioning, the notion of temporal becoming or passage goes beyond the experience of whoosh in the specious present. But that's all. I mean, there's the future, the present, the past, and there's the presence of experience. But with regard to the myth of passage that Williams is talking about, I'm saying a B theorist could deny that it's a myth and still, the R theorist. I mean, the B theorist, that's the difference between the two. I mean, that's why B theorists want to make it subjective. That's why temporal realism, it's realist in this further sense of being out there.
I wanted to follow up on Ulrich's question, which I think connects with those other questions, because if I understand you correctly, you're distancing yourself from the B theory has to do with the fact that it is indeed static. It leaves out the dynamic aspect, which experientially we're committed to. And so you prefer the R theory, which reintroduces dynamism into our conception of reality. But if you have this kind of commitment to experience, then what about this further stuff that you're alluding to, but which you haven't elaborated on, because as Ariel mentioned and the other questions that came up, our experience is not just of being presented with whatever we're presented. Our experience does involve, just as conspicuously, the futurity of future events, the pastness of past events, and the great asymmetries between being future and being past, or something I already asked.
Okay, well,
and just to finish the question, if we already are opening these floodgates, and reintroducing dynamism, let's reintroduce the whole thing with the future, the past, and the present.
Yeah, well,
and deal with the paradoxes and the various good reasons we had to maybe distance ourselves from that for a while. But let's take on those arguments and reintroduce time with all its richness as we know it from experience.
Yeah, well, invite me back next time, and I'll give you the answers.
Theory is dynamic.
But what one has to be careful here is to think that I'm distancing myself from a B theory in too great a way, because I'm not. My introducing dynamism as grounded in an earlier than relation, as a primitive earlier than relation, is a far cry from any a-theoretic account of dynamism in terms of tense properties or actualization of possible worlds or Ersatzbeaver, the whole shebang. So from an ontological point of view, there is a difference, because my R relations are different from the B relations, but there's no a-theoretical postulates. And as far as giving a wider account of our experience of time to include becoming, in the sense of passage to the future, or the presence of experience, which I think I basically said what I think is the case. There is no property to be present, it's just to be presented. That is work that needs to be done, I would agree.
Okay. So, if we're right on time, let's thank our speaker. And, we are reconvening at 1:15, which